Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Jennifer Gunn and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And today we're very happy to be working with our colleagues and friends in religious studies to present the annual Retzel Family Lecture. If you'd like to sign up for the religious studies or the Islamic studies newsletters, we'll put the URL or the link for doing so in the chat in just a few minutes, and again at the end of the program today. March appears to be Religion Month at the IAS. Next week, same time, different Zoom link, we'll be hosting a panel on Talking to the Dead, an interfaith discussion on life and death with the Ragamala Dance Company. Before we get started, I just want to give you a few Zoom instructions and announcements. This is a Zoom webinar, which means that the chat box has been partially disabled. We want you to type any questions you have into the Q&A box, the little two balloons at the bottom of your screen. You can type the questions in at any time, and then we will be reading them to the speaker at the end of the presentation. If you'd like subtitles for this talk, click on the box at the bottom of your screen that says live transcript and then show subtitles. A couple of announcements. I encourage all of you to register and attend a fabulous reading and discussion tomorrow afternoon with Nikki Finney, the National Book Award winning poet and activist. You can also, if you are interested in the Humanities Without Walls Grand Research Challenge grants, there will be an information session tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 3:30 about the grants and seed grants. That event will be recorded. And information for graduate students who are interested in applying for the Human in the Data MnDrive Summer Fellowship Program is available on the IAS website. Applications for that are due on March 10th. So I'd like to start by reminding us that we are all residing on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The Institute for Advanced Study acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history, and this land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about our relationships with the land and with each other. The Institute for Advanced Study is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. We're very happy to have Professor of English Nabil Matar here to introduce our speaker. Professor Matar is a member of the Religious Studies Program Steering Committee and a founding member of the new Islamic Studies Program. He is also Presidential Professor in the President's Interdisciplinary Initiative on Arts and Humanities and holds the Samuel Russell Chair in the Humanities. Professor Matar.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for being with us in this Zoom meeting. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2021 Russell Family Lecture. This is the 8th in a series of nearly annual. Last year we were unable to offer it. These are lectures in religious studies launched in 2011 and made possible by the generous support of Calvin and Caroline Ratzel, along with many other donors. This endowment makes it possible for our Interdepartmental Religious Studies program, and now its affiliated Islamic Studies program, to bring in top scholars in this interdisciplinary field. Over the years, we have featured historians of religion, a biblical studies scholar, specialists in religion and the environment, and in religion and law. We are very grateful to the Ratzel family, to Cal Ratzel, who was instrumental in establishing this interdepartmental program, and to everyone who has supported this lectureship over the years. Allow me also to thank Jennifer Gunn and Susanna Smith at the IAS for partnering with us again this year. They always help us in what is now an established tradition. Also, IAS staff members, Brianna Menning and Abby Travis, deserve a special thank you for having done the lion's share of work to make this event possible. And last but not least, the program wishes to thank Teddy Anderson, our religious studies student. He's a student worker, for all his communications work, creating the flyer, working with Mohammed, and publicity and all the rest of it. According to Professor Kilday, who's the director of the religious studies program, without Teddy, none of us would be here today. I'm very, very pleased to present to you and introduce Mohammed. I'd read many of his works before I even met him. I met him a few years back, and it is a pleasure to have him with us today. Mohammad Hassan Khalil is Professor of Religious Studies, an Adjunct Professor of Law, and the Director of the Muslim Studies Program at Michigan State University. Before returning to his hometown of East Lansing in Michigan, he was an Assistant Professor of Religion and Visiting Professor of Law at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's an extremely productive scholar. I will mention just a few of his publications. Islam and the Fate of Others, The Salvation Question, published by Oxford University Press in 2012, and then in Indonesian translation, published in 2016. Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. He also edited Between Heaven and Hell, Islam, Salvation, and the Fate of Others, again, Oxford University Press in 2013. And Muslims and US Politics Today, A Defining Moment, ILEX, and Harvard University Press just 2 years ago. He is the lead investigator of the Muslims of the Midwest Digital Archive, and he has presented papers at various national and international congresses and has published peer-reviewed articles in journals and other outlets. As I said, I've known Mohammed through his work, really admire his scholarship and his dedication, and I'm very, very happy to have him with us today. Mohammed.
Thank you, Professor Matar, for that very generous introduction. It's really an honor to be here, and I want to thank, first of all, Professor Jeannie Kilday for inviting me, and everyone who was working with me to set this up, including Abby Travis, Brianna Menning, Dr. Jennifer Gunn, Tariq Abdul Qadir, and others I didn't interact with. And I also want to thank Professor Mohsen Gudarzi for his support as well. And I, of course, have to thank and recognize the Retzel family for establishing this lecture series. Again, as I say, it's an honor to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. I hope you all can see this. And if at any time there are any technical issues, please don't hesitate to let me know. And we'll go ahead and get started. So the title of this lecture is the same as the title of my book, Islam and the Fate of Others, The Salvation Question. And we begin with a question. And that question is, what does Islam say about the fate of non-Muslims? This is an often asked question, and it's one that often evokes one-dimensional responses. One popular sentiment is that Islam condemns all non-Muslims to everlasting damnation. And all you have to do is go online, YouTube, social media, if you're old-fashioned like me, the bookstore, and you will find plenty of people who say this and who present Islam in this way. Another sentiment that one might find is that Islam is an ecumenical tradition, one that embraces multiple paths. And again, you will find that online, your bookstore, etc. So when I was a graduate student and I was grappling with this question, I wanted to get a sense of, what do Muslim scholars, what have they said historically on this issue? What are the prevailing views? What are common views? What are maybe some overlooked views? And the fact of the matter is that this is not an easy question to answer. First of all, from an academic perspective, you could say the question is problematic. What do we mean by Islam? Do we mean Islamic scripture as popularly interpreted? Do we mean theologians? Do we mean Muslims in general? What do we mean by Islam? In any case, for my research, I decided to focus on the writings of Muslim theologians and thinkers. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus on just 3 extremely influential theologians and thinkers: Al-Ghazali, Ibn al-Arabi, or simply Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, this is a limited sampling. These are 3 men who were Sunni, and they do not even reflect the rich diversity within their respective schools of thought. But they do offer very interesting perspectives on this issue. And you can find parallels in other traditions. And so there's a richness, with just these 3, there's a richness that you will find, and you will find parallels, for example, in the Shi'i tradition, a richness that exists there as well. And I should stress that these are not just any 3 Sunni theologians. These are 3 extremely influential theologians. Among the most influential theologians and thinkers in the history of Islam, and who continue to be extremely influential. In fact, their writings are still very popular. And by the way, I should point out, these 3 individuals are also very different. They're distinct from one another. It's not that common that you will find a Muslim who loves Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah, right? They have very different views on things. But in any case, these 3, their views are interesting and they are consequential because of their influence. But first, let me just say a brief word on salvation in Islam, because I recognize maybe not everybody has, studied Islam thoroughly. So let me just say a few words by way of introduction. First of all, there are Muslims who will say that there is no such thing as salvation in Islam because there is no such thing as original sin. So people are born free of sin, and then they either succeed and go to paradise, they go to heaven, or they fail and they go to hell. I argue that this is actually a play on words. I think there is still a concept of salvation in Islam. You see this in one of the most famous invocations or du'at, where a Muslim will say, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Lord, grant us good in this life and the next, and protect us from the punishment of the fire. So there is a concept of being saved. That idea is there. I think it's just a play on words to say there is no salvation in Islam. In any case, there is when you read the Islamic holy book, the Quran, you notice that that those who have faith and do good, that they have a good outcome. Maybe they see it in this life, but if not, certainly in the afterlife. So there's the notion of the afterlife is, the Quran is replete with references to the afterlife, right? I always tell my students, if someone tells you they read the Quran and didn't find any reference to the afterlife, they have not read the Quran. The Quran is replete with these references. And then, of course, those who reject faith and do evil, there is a concept of hell or the fire. There is that concept. And I'll say more about these concepts throughout this lecture. Okay, so now a general comment about the orientations of Muslim theologians to this question, to the question at hand, the question of the fate of non-Muslims. To make sense of what I was reading, I utilize categories that one finds in other areas of scholarship. So I adopted this terminology. So I have, first of all, listed here exclusivists. Exclusivists maintain that only Islam is salvific, that only Islam will save you, that like the religion we call Islam, only that is salvific, and all non-Muslims will be damned. Then there are inclusivists. Inclusivists say Islam is the path to salvation, but God will save sincere non-Muslims. So one can actually Islam is still the truth and it's the preferred path. But if somebody, let's say, didn't have access to Islamic tradition, or maybe, well, we'll get into the different possibilities, that God would save sincere non-Muslims. And then there are pluralists who say that Islam is but one of multiple paths that lead to heaven. They are equally salvific. All right. Now, when I was doing the research for this, what I found that was very interesting is that it was very hard to find clear-cut examples of pre-modern Muslim pluralists and exclusivists. In other words, the prevailing orientation was actually inclusivism. Now, I was surprised. I actually thought I would find many examples of exclusivists and pluralists. I only could find one clear-cut example of a pre-modern Muslim exclusivist, and that was Ibn Hazm. And by the way, I want to stress, I'm talking here about views on salvation, I'm not talking about, whether a religion is tolerated in a particular city. And, I'm just focusing here on salvation discourse. I only could find one example, and that was Ibn Hazm from Al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia or Muslim Spain. Others would make statements that seemed exclusivistic, but then they would add a qualifier. So for example, in Nawawi, one of the most famous scholars, says, yeah, only Muslims can enter heaven. But if a non-Muslim didn't hear about Islam, they could be excused. So, and of course, I realize that's a very narrow, option there. But the point is that he allows for the possibility of a non-Muslim entering heaven. So the big question that I'm going to be grappling with, or that I grapple with, is, well, what kind of inclusivism dominates historically? And I'll say more about that later. Now, exclusivists and pluralists, you will find them in the modern era. And all you have to do is go on YouTube and you'll see plenty of examples of both. But it was interesting. And by the way, I did not find any clear-cut example of a pre-modern Muslim pluralist. Even Rumi, the famous Sufi poet, I could not classify him as a pluralist. So anyway, I'll touch on some of this a bit later. Now, one might ask, okay, how do people justify these positions, exclusivism, pluralism, and inclusivism? Often, not always, but usually, people will invoke scripture. They'll invoke the Quran and the hadiths, the reports of things the Prophet said, did, and so on. Now, for pluralists, and I've already given away that pluralists tend to dominate, they tend to appear, I shouldn't say dominate, but they appear in the modern era. Pluralists will tend to focus on passages of the Quran like Surah 5, verse 48, which reads, we, and by the way, we here is God speaking in the royal plural, all right? So it's still one God speaking in the royal plural. We have assigned a law and a path to each of you. If God had so willed, he would have made you one community, but he wanted to test you through that which he has given you. So raised to do good, you will all return to God, and he will make clear to you the matters about which you differ. So here the pluralist would say, look, this is explicitly saying that God wants diversity, religious diversity. Now, the response to this is that this is not an endorsement of other paths, especially in a context in which God's final revelation, Islam, is available. So the response is that, look, yeah, Muslims believe in Moses and the Torah. They believe in Jesus and the gospel, in the singular gospel, the Injil. But now that Muhammad has arrived, his message abrogates, cancels out the earlier ones. And so the response to this is, well, that this passage is not endorsing the other paths. Now, keep in mind, this debate goes back and forth. So there's going to be a response to this. Well, why would God say race to do good if God is talking about people of old? So it just goes back and forth. I just want to give you a taste of the debate. Another passage, maybe the most popular passage in pluralist discourse, is Surah 2, verse 62. This is Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah 2, verse 62. By the way, this Surah 5, that's Surah Al-Ma'idah, the name of the chapter of the Quran, or the Surah of the Quran. So here's Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 62, which says, the believers, the Jews, the Christians, and the Sabians. Now, who are the Sabians? We could have a whole lecture on that. All those who have faith in God and the last day and do good will have their rewards with their Lord. No fear for them, nor will they grieve. And by the way, there's a very similar passage in Surah 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 69. So here the pluralist says, look, this is explicit. This is explicitly saying that that Christians, Jews, and others who are righteous will be rewarded. And that's understood, taken to mean in the afterlife, and maybe even in this life, but certainly in the afterlife. The response to this is that the meaning is restricted. So some might say that, yeah, here Christians and Jews and Sabians, these are like tribal designations. So this would only apply to Christians and Jews who accept Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, like they believe in the Islamic message. Another perspective is that this is referring to Jews and Christians before the Prophet Muhammad. So you get this response that no, the meaning here is actually restricted. Okay, well, what about the exclusivists? What do they point to? Well, one passage they'll point to is Surah 3, which is Ali Imran, verse 85. By the way, the Quran has 114 surahs or chapters. And I'm using chapters out of convenience. That's maybe not the best translation, but we'll just go with it. So here's Surah 3, verse 85. If anyone seeks a religion or way, deen, other than Islam or al-Islam, it will not be accepted from them. They will be among the losers in the hereafter. So the exclusivist says, look, this is clear. It's saying that Islam is the only thing, the only religion that God will accept today after the revelation of the Quran. The response to this is that the term Islam or al-Islam simply means the submission, as in submission to God. So some will go back and say, well, wait a minute. Actually, Islam, the idea that this is the official name of the religion that we all call Islam today, this is not necessarily the case in the Quran, because Islam, the word just means submission. And a Muslim is anyone who submits to God. That's why it said, the Quran itself, elsewhere, refers to Abraham and Joseph and others as Muslims, because they submitted to God. It doesn't mean that they are Muslim like they are part of Muhammad's community. No, they lived before Muhammad. So, and then again, you can imagine this debate goes back and forth. I'm just giving you a taste of the debate. Exclusivists will also point to various Quranic condemnations of Jews, Christians, and others. And here the response is that these passages are limited to specific Jews, Christians, and other non-Muslims and must be contextualized. And here they would usually add that there are, in fact, passages that praise certain non-Muslims. Now, how about the inclusivists? Remember, the inclusivists say, Islam is the path, it is the truth, but God will save sincere non-Muslims. Now, who is a sincere non-Muslim? We'll get back to that. Inclusivists will often point to various passages, but maybe the most common passage that is invoked in inclusivist discourse is Surah 17, Surah Al-Isra, verse 15, which says, we, and again, we here is God speaking in the royal plural, we do not punish until we have sent a messenger. And this is widely interpreted to mean that God will not punish someone unless they receive the message of the messenger. Now, there are, as I say here, miscellaneous responses. Some will say a messenger is actually a stand-in for the intellect or something like that. But the fact of the matter is you don't have too many responses to this. And that's because inclusivism has been and is still the dominant orientation. This is widely accepted as it's commonly interpreted, that one has to receive the message of the messenger before that person can be held accountable. What one finds then, that's what's really interesting then, is that there is actually a spectrum of inclusivisms. As you find Muslims debating who qualifies as a sincere non-Muslim. Or presented differently, at what point can you say that somebody has received the message? So in my book, I talk about the distinction between what I call limited inclusivists and liberal inclusivists. Now, limited, and I know I'm using a lot of terminology here. I hope it's not too confusing, but limited inclusivists, they basically just say, once you hear about Islam, that's it. Like that person is expected to convert at that point. On the other end of the spectrum, you have liberal inclusivists who say, yeah, it all just depends on your state of thinking. Like if you do not find Muhammad's message compelling, then God will not take you to account, right? You haven't really received it. So this is, it's a big spectrum here, obviously. All right. Now, let's focus on the three scholars, the three theologians and thinkers that I mentioned earlier, Al-Ghazali, Ibn al-Arabi, and Ibn Taymiya. Let's begin with Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali, some consider him the most influential Muslim theologian of all time. He's from Northeast Iran. Was born in Northeast Iran, passes away in Northeast Iran, but he moved around quite a bit. Was a prominent professor at the Nizamiya school in Baghdad, an extremely influential and interesting Muslim theologian and thinker. And with Al-Ghazali, and by the way, he dies in the ever so easy to remember year of 1111 in the Common Era, or 505 in the Islamic calendar. So that's pretty neat. My students like that. Now, let's look at Al-Ghazali and his view, his inclusivism. And by the way, the three scholars we're going to look at represent different forms of inclusivism. Al-Ghazali, in a treatise called Faisal al-Tafriqa, which means the decisive criterion, he writes about, actually his focus is really intra-Muslim inclusivism. In other words, Muslims sort of having a more open-minded view of other Muslims and the perspective the idea that they could go to heaven. And he's actually responding to those who would prefer to limit who could enter heaven to a very specific group of Muslims. And he's trying to say, no, God is merciful and will admit all kinds of Muslims. In the process of making this argument, he discusses three types of non-Muslims. So he actually goes beyond talking about Muslims and begins to talk about non-Muslims. And he says that there are three types of non-Muslims. First, there are those who never heard of the Prophet Muhammad. They've never heard of the Prophet. Second group are those who know about the Prophet but reject him. So they've heard about the Prophet Muhammad. They've heard that Muslims claim that he performed miracles. Here's the Quran. They know what's going on, but they reject him. And then three, those who heard only negative things about him. They heard that there's some arch liar named Muhammad. Okay. Al-Ghazali says that the first and third type of non-Muslim, third category of non-Muslim, they will be saved. They will be excused. God will not punish those non-Muslims for being non-Muslim. But the second group, they will be damned. So he's pretty clear on that. However, what's interesting about Al-Ghazali is as he continues writing, he describes what I describe as a kind of fourth category of non-Muslims. He says, but look, if there's a non-Muslim who knows about the Prophet, they hear about the miracles, they hear about the Quran, etc., and they actively investigate his truth claims, and they pass away without ever converting, God would save that individual. God would excuse that individual. And Al-Ghazali never gives like a time limit, like they have a week to study and convert. He just says that if somebody, and the way he presents it is this, he says, look, if there's a non-Muslim who is sincere and they hear that Muhammad performed miracles and then this and that, they would take it upon themselves to actively study the tradition. And so what he's saying is that if they actively study and then at some point they pass away, they demonstrated their sincerity and they would also enter paradise, or they would be excused for not being non-Muslim. And you'll notice here there are, he mentions three categories. I've added a fourth. You'll notice the majority, he has them being saved. And this goes along with his optimism. He has an optimistic view that most people in the world will ultimately be saved. There may be many people who may have a brief punishment, including many Muslims who are sinners. And I should point out that the prevailing view, the majority, not unanimous, it's not that everybody believes this, but the prevailing view is that Muslims who were sinners, who were unrepentant and committed major sins, that they may be punished for a time and then ultimately saved. Again, not everybody believes this, but that is the prevailing view. So Al-Ghazali is saying, yeah, look, there could be Muslim sinners, there could be non-Muslims who may be punished for a time, but then ultimately saved. And he goes on to actually give specific examples of saved non-Muslims. So he says, look, the Byzantine Christians, or you could say Eastern Roman Christians, and he mentions the distant Turkic tribes. Now, what's interesting about this, by the way, is that the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Christians were Trinitarian. It's very common for Muslims to say, you'll hear many Muslims say, that the belief in the Trinity and belief in the divinity of Jesus is a form of shirk. And shirk is the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. Al-Ghazali would consider belief in the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus, he would consider it as shirk if that Christian who believes this they encountered the Islamic message and rejected it. But if that Christian did not really encounter the Islamic tradition, then Al-Ghazali elsewhere says that belief in the Trinity is not actually shirk. They're not actually believing in multiple deities, because from their perspective, they're thinking of different aspects of the one God. And this is a difficult thing to explain. And so I'll leave it at that. And if there are questions, I can elaborate. His mentioning distant Turkic tribes is also interesting. And by the way, many of them are polytheistic. So this raises some questions. You know, what is Al-Ghazali? So what's he saying here? And it seems that what he's saying is that it all comes down to what you have been exposed to. Now, there are other Muslims who would say you should arrive at monotheism even if you've never had an encounter with the Islamic message. Al-Ghazali is not saying that. Al-Ghazali is saying you have to encounter the Islamic message before you are held accountable for not believing in the one God as understood by Muslims. And ultimately, he wants to present an optimistic view of the afterlife. He says that because of divine mercy or rahmah, salvation will be the norm, damnation the exception. And he says that it's only for a small minority, the truly wicked, that they will have everlasting damnation. Now, how small is this minority? I mean, Al-Ghazali says that just as it is rare today to find somebody who doesn't want to live, it will be rare for somebody to be punished eternally or to have everlasting damnation. Now, having said this, I should point out something just as an aside. In another work, where Al-Ghazali is describing the names of God, he says that because of God's mercy, every form of punishment it serves a purpose. God doesn't just punish for the sake of punishing, but the punishment actually is to rectify the person being punished. And he adds cryptically that there is a secret behind this that I cannot reveal. And so as a reader, you're just sort of left wondering, what did he mean? Anyway, he leaves it at that. All right. Now let's turn to Ibn al-Arabi, or simply Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi is from Al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia or Muslim Spain. He travels quite a bit, ends up in near Damascus. And he dies in 1240 of the Common Era. Ibn Arabi, in a lot of contemporary works, is presented as a pluralist, and that's problematic. He does present Islam as trumping other paths. And one thing I should point out about Ibn Arabi is that he is a Sufi, he is a mystic, and his writings are difficult to analyze. He's not your sort of standard theologian. He is a Sufi, he's a mystic, and he's approaching various subjects in ways that open themselves to many different interpretations. Nevertheless, I think one can arrive at some basic conclusions. First of all, he does refer to, really everything, all religious paths as coming from God. Everything, actually. If you lie right now, ultimately God created that. Everything is coming from God. So he recognizes the value of everything in the world, every path, every statement. But there are certain religious paths that help you become a better person. Now, he recognizes the light, if you will, of other religious paths. And he actually refers to the previous religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, etc., as lights. But he says that when Islam arrives, Islam is like sunlight. It's not that it's like destroying the other light. It's so, illuminating that you don't see the other lights. So he does present Islam in a kind of as trumping the other paths. Nevertheless, he was a liberal inclusivist. Now remember, inclusivists say Islam is the path, it's the truth, it's the best, but God will save sincere non-Muslims. And for Ibn al-Arabi, this means a lot of non-Muslims. In fact, he has a vision where he sees paradise, and he says that there are 5,105 degrees of paradise, and only 12 of them, if I recall correctly, are for Muslims. Yeah, it was 12. Only 12 are for Muslims. So he's imagining a heaven filled with mostly non-Muslims, or at least I'm using the term Muslim, non-Muslim as we use it today, as we commonly use it. And to justify this, or one justification for this, comes from his reading of Surah 17, verse 15, Surah Al-Isra, verse 15, specifically the part of the verse that we saw earlier, where we have God speaking in the royal plural. We do not punish until we have sent a messenger. Ibn Arabi focuses on this word messenger. He says, note that God said messenger. God didn't say a person, God said a messenger. So you have to be able to see the messenger as a messenger before you can be held accountable. If you don't see Muhammad as a messenger, then he's just a person to you. So it's an interesting argument. Of course, one that's, will maybe persuade some, not others, but he's focusing on the use of the word messenger. What's interesting also about Ibn Arabi is his description of hell. He does speak of hell. He speaks of the damned remaining forever in hell. Yes. However, hell is a creation of God. And one of the things that one notices from reading the Quran and the Hadiths is that divine mercy is often emphasized and stressed. And there are Hadiths, reports, where the Prophet Muhammad is quoted as saying that God's mercy, God's rahmah, overwhelms or overcomes God's wrath, the ghadab. And so Ibn Arabi says that the people in hell eventually will receive God's mercy. And so they will remain in hell. They're not going to heaven. They will remain in hell, but they will actually find mercy in hell, and they will find contentment actually in hell. And he says, there are a lot of things he says about this, but one of the more interesting things is he says, look, of all the words God uses to describe punishment, the one that's most often used is adhab. And if you look at the root of the word adhab, adhab, if you look at the root, it actually connotes sweetness, pleasantness. So he says, when the people of hell recognize their, when they submit finally, then they will find sweetness, they will find pleasantness, a very, esoteric interpretation, a mystical interpretation. All right. Now, because of time, I'm going to move a little bit quickly here. This is our third and the final pre-modern theologian, and that's Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah is born in Haran, which is at the border of Turkey and Syria, and he ends up passing away in 1328 of the Common Era in Damascus. He actually was imprisoned in the citadel of Damascus, and he often would get into trouble with the politicians. And so he'd be imprisoned because of his strong positions, strong views, and criticisms of political leaders, among other things. Ibn Taymiyyah is somebody, so I mentioned Ibn Arabi, he's a prominent Sufi. Ibn Taymiyyah has a reputation of being a kind of traditionalist. He's very influential among modern Salafis, although one can argue that modern Salafis, their views might not always match with Ibn Taymiyyah's views. In any case, Ibn Taymiyyah espouses a kind of limited inclusivism in his fatwas, his religious opinions. By the way, I never mentioned the writings of Ibn al-Arabi, where he discusses the views that I mentioned. Those would be in al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah and Fusus al-Hikam. So al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, and Fusus al-Hikam, the bezels of wisdom. These are two very popular works, one really long, one kind of short, by Ibn al-Arabi. Ibn Taymiyyah, as I mentioned, has these fatwas, these scholarly opinions that are collected today. Anyway, what we find with Ibn Taymiyyah is he is a limited inclusivist. He says for somebody to be held accountable before God, they have, once they receive the message of Islam, of the Prophet Muhammad, once they receive that message, they are now accountable. They are expected now to take it seriously, to convert. And going back to that passage that we've been looking at, Surah 17, verse 15, we do not punish until we have sent a messenger. Remember, Ibn Arabi was focusing on the word messenger. Like you have to see that that person is really a messenger. Ibn Taymiyyah focuses on the word sent. Okay? He focuses on the word sent. In other words, once God sends the message and then you receive it, then at that point one is expected to convert at that point. What's interesting about, and by the way, I do want to clarify, for Ibn Taymiyyah, one would really have to encounter the Islamic message. They can't just encounter like a Muslim leader. They have to encounter the Islamic message. Okay. What's interesting about Ibn Taymiyyah is what happens at the very end of his life. He is imprisoned in the citadel of Damascus. He has a reputation of having a kind of conservative, kind of strict views on things. That's the reputation, at least. And while he's imprisoned in the citadel of Damascus, he produces a treatise, the last treatise he writes, it would seem, before his pen was confiscated. And it's a treatise in which he argues that the people who are in hell, the wicked who are in hell, they will dwell in hell for ages, but not forever. Not forever. And so this is interesting because the prevailing view has been that at least some people will remain in hell forever. And Ibn Taymiyyah is actually challenging this. Now, by the way, this is a very controversial issue. And all you have to do is Google Ibn Taymiyyah and hell, is it forever or not? What did Ibn Taymiyyah say? And you'll see all kinds of people denying that this was his position. Either they will say he never wrote this, he never said this, or he said it but then changed his mind. Just so you know, these are pretty much overwhelmingly modern claims. Nobody back then, as far as we know, was saying that. In fact, his student, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, quotes him and expands on this argument in 3 separate works. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I'll just keep it simple. So Ibn Taymiyyah says, look, there will be people in hell, but they're not going to be there forever. The believers, those who have a little bit of faith, they'll be taken out of hell. Then the people of hell, they'll remain in it for ages. Like he still has in mind something, long, but eventually even they will be saved. And there are statements attributed to the companions of the Prophet, like there's a statement attributed to Omar, the second caliph. He's quoted as saying that after the people in hell spend a long time, they will eventually go to heaven. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, he builds this whole argument where he says, look, because divine mercy overcomes wrath, eventually all of humanity will one day inhabit paradise. Now, this was very controversial back even in his time, you have a man named Taqiyuddin as-Subki, a scholar, who challenges Ibn Taymiyyah. Are you saying that Pharaoh could go to heaven? I mean, not even non-Muslims say that. That's pretty much what he says, believe it or not. So it's a controversial thing, but Ibn Taymiyyah, that's the last thing he writes before his pen is confiscated, and it survives in the writings of his student as well. We have the manuscript, or a manuscript. I'm not going to say the original, but a manuscript, a couple of them actually, and it was actually published for the first time in 1995. And then you have his students quoting him in 3 well-known works. And again, there's a lot more to say about that. But just think about the implications of that. I mean, that's saying every single human being could end up in heaven. Very controversial, but also very interesting. So what we find from this very brief sketch that I've presented here, we see 2 common themes in medieval, and I will add here, modern salvation discourse. The 2 common themes are, first, Islamic supersessionism. These people do present Islam as superseding, as abrogating the earlier paths, and as being the preferred path, but they also emphasize divine mercy or rahmah. And you see this concept of rahmah at the beginning of almost every surah of the Quran. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, God, the Lord of mercy, the bestower of mercy. And we find it elsewhere, and I've given examples from the Hadith corpus. And I point this out because often you will hear it said that when Muslims emphasize mercy, it's a modern thing. So for instance, here we have a statement by Dr. David Marshall, who, by the way, I consider him a friend and is a great scholar. But he has a statement in his book, God, Muhammad, and the Unbelievers, where he says the attractive emphasis on the centrality in the Quran of divine mercy is more of a modern trend. And I would like to argue that no, here we see these very influential pre-modern Muslim scholars developing or presenting views that are predicated on the concept of divine mercy. What are modern trends? Well, first of all, the growth of pluralism. We see more and more Muslim writers today promoting a form of pluralism, like Professor Jerusha Rhodes, Professor Abdulaziz Seshadina, who, by the way, comes from the Shi'i tradition, Professor Farid Ishaq of South Africa, Professor William Chittick, who belongs to what's called the perennialist school of thought. So we see different kinds of pluralism. You know, some like Abdulaziz Seshadina, who speaks of an Abrahamic pluralism, where Jews and Christians and Muslims can attain paradise. You have Jerusha Rhodes, Professor Jerusha Rhodes, Professor Farid Ishaq, who you could say emphasize deeds and maybe not so much creeds. And I'm kind of oversimplifying for the sake of, just because of time, but I encourage you to look at their works to get the full picture. And then Professor William Chittick, following the perennialist school of thought, where they see multiple religious paths as being true and salvific. We also see the growth of exclusivism, the idea that only Muslims will go to heaven. And you see this, for instance, in YouTube clips featuring the popular Indian preacher Zakir Naik. You see this in the writings of the Egyptian member of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the, we'll just say Islamist, Sayyid Qutb. And we see, and I should clarify, with Sayyid Qutb, who was executed in 1966 by the Egyptian government, we see it actually more in his later writings. You know, he's imprisoned for quite over a decade and a half in Egypt. In his earlier writings, he seems to be open to the possibility of non-Muslims going to heaven. At least that's the impression I get from reading him. But then in his later writings, you get the impression it's only a limited group of Muslims who are going to heaven. Now, keep in mind, the prevailing school of thought or orientation is still inclusivism. And what we see is people like Muhammad Rashid Rida, who is originally from Tripoli in modern-day Lebanon, who moves to Egypt, a very influential early 20th century writer, we see him taking the earlier doctrines and making them more, you could say, more sort of liberal. You know, if we think of the term liberal inclusivism, he takes Al-Ghazali's criterion for salvation and he makes it more liberal. So he says, a non-Muslim will only be held accountable, will only be accountable if they receive the Islamic message, but they have to receive it in a way that motivates them to really take it seriously. To really, like, you have to actually, there has to be a moment where you think this could be the truth. So he goes a step further than Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali doesn't quite say that. If you recall, Al-Ghazali says once you hear about the Prophet, you have to investigate, you have to study, but he never says that if you don't find it convincing or compelling, then that's okay. Al-Ghazali doesn't say that. By the way, Rashid Rida also is moved by the idea that everybody would leave hell and go to heaven. And he presents it kind of cautiously in one of his in his periodical Al-Manar. And the next issue, you see a whole bunch of readers complaining that this is wrong. This is and Rida kind of backs off a little bit, and he says, "Well, I'm not saying that I definitely believe this, but you know, it's possible." Anyway, so we go back to this question: what does Islam say about the fate of non-Muslims? We've seen some interesting perspectives in this lecture. At least I find them interesting. But now nobody that I've studied offers an indisputable resolution. But what I noticed that was interesting is Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Taymiyyah, they all, and many others, they all felt compelled and justified to take a hermeneutic or interpretive leap of mercy, to go beyond what is explicit in Scripture without necessarily contradicting it. And if one accepts the premise that the ethos of the Quran compels this leap of mercy, then the end result is a positive ambiguity, the kind of ambiguity that leaves believers with a deep sense of humility and hope for humanity. And with that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to take your questions. And I'll stop the share here.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. That is really wonderful. I hope the answers to the questions will not be ambiguous. So I got some questions here for you. And first of all, I mean, one question is, what does it mean for a Christian or a non-Muslim to accept Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran and stay as a Christian or a non-Muslim?
Yeah, great question. In the writings of the pre-modern scholars that I look at, they have in mind conversion. If we look at some of the modern writers, then actually there is an interesting case of a scholar named Professor Mahmoud Ayyub. And Professor Ayyub, if I recall correctly, he writes about how a Christian could remain a Christian as long as they just believe that Muhammad was a prophet. Like they just don't deny Muhammad as a prophet, but then they could continue as a Christian. Now, that raises all kinds of questions. How does that work? But in any case, you will find some modern writers who say this, but the pre-modern writers that I was looking at, they had in mind conversion.
Okay, thank you. And, picking up on the question is that in the modern day with technology and social media, etc., I mean, everybody is exposed to something of Islam. So in a way, nobody can say that they haven't heard of it. So again, I mean, in the modern period, is the expectation, as you just suggested, and as the question is asking, is it just that, you know about it, or, I mean, if there's scale, how do we measure it?
Right. Yeah, great question. Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the reasons, one of the arguments that modern exclusivists will make. They will say, look, everybody now is exposed to Islam. All it takes is a Google search. But the other thing to keep in mind, though, too, is this idea that if you hear negative things about Islam, that's also a factor. And that's what we see in Al-Ghazali's writings. And so you'll have, I remember I organized a conference at the University of Illinois in 2010, and I brought together a whole bunch of different kinds of scholars representing a whole bunch of perspectives. And there was one scholar who was actually saying that, pushing for an inclusivist interpretation, kind of limited, or at least it seemed a limited inclusivist position. And the scholar said, but look, I don't think the average American has necessarily received the Islamic message in a positive way. And so, so that becomes another, that's kind of like an empirical discussion, right? You know, who has, at what point do you receive the Islamic message in a good way?
Okay.
Yeah.
Quick question. If one were to read one of your two books, Islam and the Fate of Others or Between Heaven and Hell, which one would you recommend? That's a quick question. I'll come back to others. But
well, yeah, first of all, I would say get it from the library because they charge too much.
That's true.
So Islam and the Fate of Others, the Salvation Question, that's the one that I authored. That's what you saw presented here. Between Heaven and Hell, that's an edited volume, actually based on the conference that I just described. So in that book, you'll get a bunch of other people's perspectives, which is great. So I would just say, if you want to get a whole bunch of perspectives, check out both from the library.
Okay. You know, when, again, the question is, when do pluralist views begin to appear? I mean, you're looking, and I'm adding to the question, that's a question, but kind of, I'm looking at it because it fascinates me. You know, I mean, you're looking at Ghazali, so we're looking at what, 12th century, he dies 1111 AD. Is there anything before that? I mean, you have all these records of dialogues and disputations between monks and rulers, you know, whether it's, you know, real or not. But the whole point is that they are dated back to the 8th century, as far back, even to the 7th century. I mean, claims are made that some of them are. And the whole point of them is to show a sense, if not inclusiveness, of dialogue that accepts. I mean, does that continue into, because once you get into the Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Tamiya, it's a very different, you know, landscape, first of all. It's Iran, it's kind of a larger world. And it's also a very different encounter with Christianity. I mean, this is post-Crusade, and that clearly changed the whole mind of everyone, including somebody, I mean, especially Ibn Taymiyyah. So, I mean, would you see that there was that pluralism, and coming back to the question, that appeared before these major writers?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, one of the things that is tricky is, you know, that I was focusing specifically on just salvation discourse. You know, if we're looking at, you know, people tolerating others or you know, being moved by others, or, you know, interreligious marriages and so on, you will find, of course, many examples of all that. But yeah, it was interesting because I could not find a clear-cut example of a pluralist when it comes to salvation. I could find plenty of liberal inclusivists, like people who speak of this Christian going to heaven, that Christian going to heaven, you know, maybe even like Ibn al-Arabi, most people in heaven are non-Muslim, but a sort of truly pluralistic view that there are multiple paths that are just, you know, they're equally salvific. I could not find a clear-cut example. And I was surprised. I thought maybe Rumi. But even Rumi, you know, he has these statements. He chastises a person for remaining Christian, for instance. So it's, yeah, I was actually a bit surprised. I didn't find any clear-cut examples. And then also I didn't find any clear-cut examples of exclusivists other than Ibn Hazm. You know, most always leave the door open for some possibility. But Ibn Hazm, in case you're wondering, he says, everybody in the world has heard about the Prophet. And even if you've heard only a rumor, that means you are responsible. And so that's maybe why his view is sort of unusual. is he has a very interesting criterion. And that's why he says that all non-Muslims would go to hell. And keep in mind, he is living in a context of Reconquista angst in Muslim Spain, right? So there could be something there as well. I don't know.
Okay. I have lots of questions, so I'm going to try and summarize. One question is about the issue of the salvation of the damned. And that's kind of, in one tradition, I mean, it's interesting because in one tradition, Christianity, and one of the questions here is specifying Orthodox Christianity, is that that is very much accepted, that the devil will be, even the devil will be finally saved. On the other hand, in kind of the other tradition of Christianity, it is totally unacceptable. So do you see that the Islamic tradition was kind of negotiating between these two?
Yeah, I find some interesting parallels. You know, you look at the views, at least ascribed to Origen in the Christian tradition, and the nature of the debate in the Christian tradition, and you find some really interesting parallels. You know, what was interesting is I gave a lecture in Amman, Jordan, on this issue, and I was at a conference, and I mentioned that Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, he basically says that this view that everybody would go to heaven, this is something for those who are like really deep in knowledge. It's not just for anybody. You know, it's kind of an elitist, you know, way of approaching it. And because the idea is that if everybody thinks that, they'll just take it easy. You know, and what was interesting is right after that, there was a woman who came up to me, and she's Christian, and she says that that's exactly their teaching in her, and I forget exactly her denomination, but that's what she was taught in her church. So yeah, there are interesting parallels. You will find, you know, as I say, this is a very controversial issue. And all you have to do is Google Ibn Taymiyyah, hell forever, and you'll see exactly what I mean.
I can imagine. Okay. God. Okay. This is the question. I wanted to ask if any of the three theologians address the question of language, Arabic language, since there are verses that refer to that, such as we have sent it down in Arabic about the Quran. So I think it's an interesting question, the point that, you know, to what extent is the relationship between Islam and Arabic, you know, foundational within these arguments?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. And interestingly, I don't recall seeing that coming up in the discussions that I was, the you know, pre-modern writings that I was looking at. Keep in mind, Arabic is kind of this, like, it's the language, right? It's the language you learn in much of their world. So even if you're out in, you know, Spain, that's what you're learning, Al-Andalus. So that issue did not come up as much. In modern writings, it comes up quite a bit. You'll see, for example, modern Muslim pluralists really stressing this point, that Muhammad was for the Arabs, he was for a certain group of people, not all of humanity. You'll see some pluralists making that argument, and that God wanted other paths for other peoples. By the way, I should point out one thing that just came to my mind. Ibn Taymiyyah, who, as I said, is kind of more on the conservative side on some of these issues, other than the issue of hell, he explicitly rejects the idea that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, is just for the Arabs. And he's responding to a Christian who makes that argument, actually, in a treatise. So he responds with this, like, published today, it's a 2-volume set, or is it 4? Al-Jawab al-Sahih liman baddala din al-Masih. I mean, he has this huge response to this claim that the Prophet Muhammad is just for the Arabs. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, that's unacceptable. So that's one thing that I remember, but yeah.
But Shafi'i, in a sense, emphasized Arabic. You know,
yes.
in his Risala, he was saying, you know, to be a Muslim is to know the Arabic in order to be able to read the Quran.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point. And what's interesting about it too is that, like, certainly learning Arabic is emphasized, it's stressed, but you do find some interesting debates. You know, for example, can you recite the Quran in Farsi, in Persian, if you haven't learned Arabic yet? And you'll find some scholars who say, yeah, that's fine. And so it's an interesting issue, but certainly the Arabic dimension is there. It's that's why most Friday sermons to this day are in Arabic, no matter where, or at least part of it, I should say, part of it is in Arabic.
Okay. I know this is kind of too general a question, but is there an agreement among Muslims as to the criteria for salvation? Is salvation based on God's activity or human response? And I think that has a very big theological kind of baggage behind it, but it's an important issue.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is there certainly is there's minimal agreement. The idea that God does not punish until God sends a messenger, that's of course a verse that's from the Quran, that's taken from the Quran. But what does that mean? You could say that there's a prevailing interpretation that you have to at the very least, encounter the Islamic revelation before one could be held accountable. That's kind of like the bare minimum for the vast majority of theologians. The problem, though, is once you go beyond that, there is so much disagreement, as we saw even from this lecture.
Yeah.
The other part of the question is salvation based on God's activity or human responses. Yeah, this is a big question. So it's a combination of the two, I think, is the safest answer. Because it's a combination of the two, in the sense that one is expected to have faith, to do good, but ultimately it is God's will. And there's even a famous hadith that people like to quote, where the prophet says, even he himself depends on God's will, God's grace. So it seems that there's a combination of the two.
Oh, okay. I have a couple of questions, if I may. I mean, where does Ibn Rushd fit in all this? I mean, Ibn Rushd was also living in the Andalus and, in a sense, presents his understanding of Islam in a way that becomes unacceptable later. Where do you see him in this context? And he was also a jurist. I mean, he wrote, the Maliki jurisprudence is basically Ibn Rushd. So
yes, well, yeah, and of course his philosophical worldview opens the door to a whole bunch of possibilities beyond what the theologians are saying. So it is difficult to assess. I remember trying to analyze Ibn Rushd, and I decided not to because I just found it was going to take me in a whole nother direction because of the philosophical dimension. So yeah, I guess I would say that I think there needs to be more work done at Ibn Rushd on this issue. Yeah.
Okay, I think that is. I just have a supportive observation to make, is that in my reading of early modern travelers to the Ottoman Empire, it's a kind of common motif that they all repeat the same thing. They're all, English or French. They're all saying that Islam sees salvation for the Christian, for the Jew, for the Muslim as an equal thing, and that kind of they admire it very, very much. So they actually, nearly every traveler, and I don't know where they picked it up except through the culture, because none of them seem to, very few knew Arabic, very few were reading the Quran, but it seems culturally, it was something that they must have picked up, because they would then mention it and kind of throw it back at their own societies where, obviously the discrimination between Protestant and Catholic, etc. So they kind of mentioned that, look at the Ottoman Empire specifically.
That is fascinating.
Yeah,
I wish I would have spoken with you before I wrote my book now, because that's a great,
the other thing I'd mention is Nabulsi, Abdul Ghani Nabulsi.
Yes.
At the end of the 17th century, he is amazing, because not only does he praise Christian jurists and say they are like planets in the sky, they're luminaries in the sky, but he actually denounces a Turk who had claimed that Christians will not be saved. And he actually slammed him down, and Turk was a Muslim, and he slams him down. So, it's interesting that kind of thinking, maybe not kind of jurisprudential, but in terms of cultural kind of expression was there, at least in the early modern period.
Yes, absolutely. And Nabulsi is very interesting, actually.
Okay. Any else? Looking. Okay, the questions have been. Anybody else with questions to Muhammad? This is really wonderful, Muhammad.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, in this respect, thank you so much for giving this wonderful lecture, Muhammad, and I really look forward to your future writings. I see that you have such a varied perspective on so many material. So, as we say, may Allah ya'tik al-afi. May God give you strength and all the very best.
Thank you, Professor Matar. You're very kind. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thank you for the introduction and the great questions, Professor Matar, and thank you to the Retzel family for making this lecture possible. And please come back and see us again next week. And we really appreciate all of you attending and your wonderful questions. Take care. Enjoy the sunshine.